My genesis story in the D&I space actually begins a long, long time ago when I was about 5 or 6. I won't tell you how long, a long time ago, just believe me. When I was about 5 or 6, and I remember being in the playground and experienced some racism from some of the children. So not a nice experience. But I remember back then thinking to myself, well, this feels awful. This feels horrible. I don't deserve this. Why is this happening? I also remember thinking to myself, whatever I do, and whatever I become, I'm going to make sure that others don't feel like this.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the All Inclusive podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Aggie Mutuma, an award-winning diversity, inclusion and anti-racism strategist. She's also an executive leadership coach, speaker and the CEO of Mahogany Inclusion Partners. In the episode, we dove into how Aggie's early experiences with racism shaped her DEI journey, her transformative approach to discussing race and inclusion with leaders without causing offence, and we also discussed the pivotal role of adopting principles rather than strict policies to achieve genuine inclusivity in an organisation. Aggie offers invaluable advice for leaders and organisations committed to fostering an inclusive environment where everyone feels that they truly belong. As always, before jumping into the video, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and follow on your favourite podcast platform so that you never miss an episode. That being said, let's jump in. Hi, Aggie.
Hi, how are you doing, Natasha?
Good, I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. Well, thank you.
That's good to hear. So, a little bit more about you and how you became involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Sure, no problem at all. So my genesis story in the D&I space actually begins a long, long time ago when I was about 5 or 6. I won't tell you how long, a long time ago, just believe me. When I was about 5 or 6, and I remember being in the playground and experienced some racism from some of the children. So not a nice experience. But I remember back then thinking to myself, well, this feels awful. This feels horrible. I don't deserve this. Why is this happening? I also remember thinking to myself, whatever I do and whatever I become, I'm going to make sure that others don't feel like this. So I guess that's my genesis story. I wouldn't have called it inclusion clearly as a 5 or 6 year old, but that's essentially the principle that I've taken through my whole life. And then growing up in the UK, being more aware of what's going on in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, there was quite a presence of the National Front in the UK, certainly where I lived as well. So I'd see things graffitied on walls, I'd hear people shouting things, and for a long time, the Union Jack and also the English flag for me used to signal, oh, that's someone's house. It's probably going to open the window and scream something at me as I'm walking down the road. So for a very long time. So again, lots of experience of that discrimination. Fast forward to my career as an HR leader. So, as we've shared previously, I have led people teams for organizations that most of us will probably recognize, such as Tesco Stores Limited, McDonald's Restaurants, Dreams Beds. And my roles have tended to be holistic HR. I call it holistic. Most will say it's generalist, but I'll say holistic. So, everything from recruitment, what's our employee value proposition, why would people want to work with us? What are the capabilities within the organization? Right through to the end, whether that's a merger acquisition, redundancy program, whatever that may be. And then all the beautiful pieces in between. So succession, talent development, values, behaviors, and diversity and inclusion as a beautiful golden thread running through that. Now, what I came to understand, I mean, I love the whole piece, is that it doesn't matter how great your well-being strategy is. If it's not inclusive, it is not going to deliver what you want it to deliver. It doesn't matter how great your talent attraction strategy is. If it's not inclusive, it's not going to deliver what you want it to. And not just from an identity point of view. So it's not just about women or people of color or the LGBT community. It won't deliver in the most effective way for everything. So inclusion really is this beautiful golden thread that runs all the way through. On top of that, as a lot of people leaders end up doing, I am a coach, which I love. I love being able to take people on their journeys. Previously, in my HR director roles, I would tend to coach white males because they happen to be the execs in the organizations. And in conversations about inclusion, whether it's gender or LGBTQ plus community or race, they were really reticent to engage. They didn't want to engage in the conversation, either from a fear point of view, they didn't want to get the words wrong or say the wrong thing, offend someone. Or another big driver for them was that they thought that inclusion was not about them. It's about everybody who's not a white man. So it's about the women, it's about the people of color, it's about the LGBT community, those with disabilities. And certainly from where I stand and my principles, it's inclusion is actually about everybody and diversity inclusion is about everyone showing up in the way that is most authentic for them in that environment and therefore giving their best ideas, working through things in the best way that works for them and therefore making better decisions for the organization. So I guess the three things around my experience growing up in the UK, my experience in HR and in terms of the full employee life cycle at a strategic level, and then also my coaching, those three things, many others I'm sure, came together. And that's where Mahogany Inclusion Partners was born. And that's where I then focused solely on diversity and inclusion.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a fantastic journey there, fascinating one for sure. And I think it's great to hear that you have been able to transition kind of fairly smoothly and be able to use your personal experiences from a young age and apply those effectively in the work that you're doing now and what you have been doing through your career. It's very seems like it's very people centered, which is great. What strategies have you found to be most effective when speaking with leaders about race?
Wonderful. Really, really good question. So what I will say, I'm going to do a little signpost, and I hope that's okay. On the CIPD website, so the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, there's a video of me talking about exactly that. So check that out for the long version of this answer I'm going to give you now. But what I will say is that one of the first principles or strategies is around understanding that this conversation is not easy for anyone. It is not easy for white people or people who don't experience racism in the same way because it's not a conversation they've really had to have, really. And it's not easy for those who do experience racism because it's not a conversation we want to have. We'd rather talk about something completely different and we'd rather racism didn't exist. So it's a really tough conversation for everyone to have. And then there's also the piece around how the conversation's had externally. A lot of the ways it's had is it's quite there's quite a lot of tension in it. There's a bit of finger pointing, slight understatement. There's a lot of finger pointing, and it can be had at a moral level. As in, if you do things that are racist, or if you say something racist, you're a bad person, and if you don't, you're a good person. And that's not really true about the race and racism. And especially if you want to have the conversation in organizations to make things better, it's important to park the morality piece and also understand it's difficult for everyone. And what I tend to do and what I tend to share and where I start the conversation with leaders is around, what do you want for your organization? Let's park race for a second. We'll come back to it in a second. But what do you want for your organization? So looking at the business outcomes, looking at the objectives of the organization, so what does then down the level, what does that mean for your people? So what do you want for your people? And all leaders, I don't even say most, all leaders, leadership teams I've spent time with always want a great environment for their people. They want people to grow. They want people to develop. They want people to therefore deliver for the organization because those ingredients give us that delivery. And then we talk about that line, but that most organizations have around we are an equal opportunities employer that most organizations have probably had since the mid 90s, maybe even earlier than that. Then I say to them, how true is that? How true is that in your organization? So I'm not telling them, I'm asking them. And again, in most cases, leaders will say, actually, it's not true for everyone. It's true for some of us, but it's not true for everyone. So with those almost irrefutable truths that they've shared. We want to win as an organization. We want our people to have a great time or a great experience here. We know that it's not equal right now. Right now, let's talk. So it's almost where do we agree or where do they agree? Then start the conversation there. So I'd say that's definitely a brilliant place to start.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I think from what you said, what's standing out for me is asking those open questions rather than you standing there and telling them this is what you need to do. This is what racism looks like and things like that. It's more about leading them on their own personal journeys or their own journeys to understanding what it actually race looks like
Yeah.
for the people that they work with?
Absolutely. And we do get to the place where we talk about how racism shows up, and there are the obvious and overt ways in which race shows up. And in most cases, people understand those and they probably wouldn't enact those, certainly not in the workplace anyway. They wouldn't do that. It's more the microaggression, the
Mm.
covert ways, and the unintentional ways in which there are barriers or something said or something's done that people don't understand the impact of that. That's where there's more of that sharing around. You probably won't realize this, or you may not recognize this, but here are some of the things. And you can see those light bulbs going off in people's heads. And actually, oftentimes, it's actually relating it to their own experience. Because all of this that we're talking about, whether it's HR in its fullest sense, whether it's diversity and inclusion, it's all about the human experience. What's the human experience in our organizations, and how do certain identities potentially mean we have a different experience? So when I speak to leaders about, tell me about a time when you didn't belong, when you personally didn't belong, and it could be a new football team, it could be, I don't know, the new cricket team, a new workplace, a new city you've moved in. Most of us, regardless of our identities, have examples of when we haven't belonged. So if you can link it to that and say, right, so this is how your people may be feeling, and this is why that might be happening, and here are some ways. If you're not consciously inclusive, you're probably going to be excluding someone. Just like if you walk down the road and you're not looking where you're going, you're not conscious about where you're walking, you're going to bump into someone, aren't you? Doesn't mean you meant to, but if you're focused and you're not going, let me look where I'm going. And actually, you see it happen a lot of people on their phones now, don't you? But if you're not focused and intentional about what you're doing, you're probably going to be excluding someone.
But I totally agree. I think that's really helpful, and I can totally see how connecting personal experiences to that individual helps them understand a little bit more about what people from underrepresented groups go through when they experience racism or when they hit a barrier to trying to develop and move forward in their careers at work. Thinking about organizational structures a little
Mhm.
bit, can you give some examples of inclusive policies that you have found to be kind of instrumental in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Sure, no problem. So I'm going to answer the question slightly differently, because although I've grown up in HR and I've definitely written a fair few policies, I am more of a fan of principles, which then dictate what the policies are.
Mhm.
So where I definitely start with leaders, organizations, HR teams is back to that question of what do you want for your people. So that's really helpful. So therefore, if this is what we want for our people, and this is the inclusion statement or the employee value proposition statement, what are the principles that we'd want to apply to every single situation? And yes, there are some outliers here and there, but in most of situations across our business. And this works beautifully, especially in organizations that potentially have a global footprint, perhaps, or they're situated in different areas, or they have different workforces, an office workforce, a manufacturing workforce, or a retail workforce. What are the principles that we want to apply regardless of where you are in our organization? And then once we've agreed those principles, and I would say probably a handful, let's say seven at the most, that would want to apply in most cases. They're helpful because they're almost like a guiding light, where if the policy doesn't say anything about it, you still have a guiding light. And also, they're helpful from a consistency point of view that you've got that shared experience across the organization. Then those principles can drive what those policies are in any part of the organization. So whether it's our recruitment policy, if we've said that one of our principles is that we want to reflect the societies in which we serve, if that take that as a principle, then that means from a recruitment point of view, we need to look at our workforce where it is right now and how reflective is it. If it's not yet, then what are we doing about it to bring our employees in? If one of our principles is around trusting our employees, as an example, when it comes to things such as hybrid working, I'm just picking a policy. When it comes to things such as hybrid working, as an example, it's about trust. So let's ask our people what works for them. Let's ask them to think about, because we trust them to do the right thing for the team and the business. Let's ask them how they think is going to work for the team. And let's talk about how it's going to work for the organization and have a grown up conversation where the individuals come prepared saying, this is how it works for me, this is how it works for my team, this is how I think it will work for the organization. And then we can have a grown up conversation about it. And it's either a yes, as you said it, great, brilliant, or it's actually these bits work, these bits don't work quite well. Let's meet in the middle. So we trust our people. So we're going to have grown up conversations with them. So that's a couple of examples of how those principles then filter down. So I would say principles led first, and then how do those principles then apply from a policy point of view.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, those are some great examples that you've given there. And it does make a lot of sense to start with principles rather than just go straight into doing policies. You've mentioned that through your experience in HR, you've obviously yourself written these policies, and the current work that you work with organizations in helping them to develop these principles. In doing that, what has been your biggest challenge?
Hmm. I think that the biggest challenge is, I'm going to say, sometimes the leaning on policies, and I'll speak about that not just in terms of D&I, but just in terms of the whole experience. In that policies are written at a certain place and time, right? Based on law, based on whoever happens to be writing it. Quite frankly, as well sometimes, isn't it? And I've seen wonderful ones that are human centric and they've got that trust and all the principles, etc. Definitely the ones we write and support with. But we've also seen some that are very legalistic.
Mm.
And what I find is without the right training and support and guidance and coaching and development, managers will pick up that policy and read it. And that's what they'll do. So if it's not inclusive, if it's not human centric, if it doesn't have trust in it, managers will literally pick up a policy and say, oh, the policy says no. Sorry, Roger, you can't have your time off. Or sorry, whoever, you can't have your time off, rather than that human centric piece. So I'm not sure if I answered your question actually,
No, no,
but
no. I think you do definitely. Because my follow-up question is, how important does kind of language play when we're talking? Because I know we do. It's one thing that we do talk about when we're speaking on trying to create these inclusive environments. It's the language that we use. So actually, your challenge that you've just spoken about, to me, that's one thing that stands out is the language that's being used.
Mhm, mhm. Language is important. I'm going to say two things, probably more. Two things come to mind right now. So language is really, really important. And also at the same time, what is true is that we shouldn't get stuck in language
Hmm.
and say that we can't take action because we haven't got the right language, don't know what the language is. I've coached a number of leaders who were stuck. They're like, I want to say something, I want to share, I want to speak. But one, I'm going to be on a stage, so there's no way I'm going to go and do something I'm not comfortable with and say the wrong thing. But also, rather than get it wrong, and I've seen people getting dragged on social media. I think that's the language. My kids will kill me for saying that. But anyway, so I'm going to step back as a leader and say nothing because I'd rather not get it wrong. The sad thing that happens is that your people think you don't care.
Hmm.
Your people think you're not interested because you're saying nothing. So it is important, but please don't let it be a barrier to stop you from speaking. I mean, what I would suggest is if you're not sure, get some help and don't ask your black and brown people your in the organization because there's a lot of weight in feeling as though you have to answer the questions all the time. Seek some support. I always say to my children, Google's your best friend, or get some support. There are organizations like mine, others who can support you with that. And then also ask the person in front of you. And an example for me that I'll always give is that I'm more than happy to be called a black woman because I am a black woman, and I'm happy to for people to use phrases like people of color. However, in my earlier part of my career, if you'd said I was a black woman, first of all, I would have probably said women sounds a bit old. I'm old now, so I'm okay with it. Older, so I'm okay with it. But also, because of my journey and because of the experience I had when I was younger, I didn't actually like the phrase black, only because it used to be followed by something horrible. And that's how I understood and knew the word. And that's what I came to expect. But I've moved in my experience. Also, people of color, if you speak to someone who maybe has family in America or they lived in America, it points to language that was used in the 60s, which wasn't great. So they don't love that term necessarily sometimes, or people sometimes don't like it. So I might say, yep, fine to say people of color to me. But if they said it to you, potentially, Natasha, if you said, I don't prefer that term, please don't go and say, well, Aggie said it was fine, because that's great for Aggie. Natasha doesn't like it. So it's educate yourself, get some support, but also listen to the person in front of you as well. And that would be the same for anything. Actually, I'm going to add that's not just race. I'm going to say it's the same for the LGBTQ plus community. It's the same for
Yeah.
people with abilities, because there's we moved from saying people are disabled to talk about them being disabled by society or having a disability, but now we're moving back to disabled because people aren't disabled. It's society that makes them disabled. So it's the same for any.
I agree. I think that insight that you've given can be applied to marginalized groups.
Yeah.
I think the key for me in what you've said is just to be open and to be aware and ask the question as to, do you prefer this term, or is that okay for me to say that? Like, just ask. And I think you'll then be able to make an informed decision as to whether the particular language that you're using is going to be well received or not.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes you can't always ask because it can get kind of clumsy, can't it? If you're like, "Okay, we're gonna talk
Mm.
about race now," and let's check with Natasha if she prefers people of color, if she likes, but it could get a little bit clumsy. But I think certainly when someone does say, "That doesn't quite work for me," I mean, I've had people say, "Well, Jane down the road says it's fine." I'm like, "Oh, that's nice for Jane because Jane's okay with that." However, the
Yeah,
person who finds
it's more
it,
just making sure don't be dismissive. If someone's telling you like, I don't like this, and they've
yeah,
given you an explanation, just be
yeah,
open to receive that feedback.
yeah,
I think that's the thing as well, is that I find a lot of people when they talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, they feel as though we are critiquing, or we're saying that this work needs to be done in a negative way, like it's coming from a place of negativity. So everything you're doing is wrong. You are bad for doing this or for being like this. We're going to try and make you better. We want you to be good. Like, that's not what we're trying to say. We're just trying to, I feel like we're trying to open everyone's eyes a little bit wider to ensure that they can see that there are people in your peripheral vision that you are excluding. Intention, some may be intentional, most it's unintentional. And so it's just, I think it's just trying to educate and provide the right tools and resources for people to be able to ensure that everyone is really genuinely being included and they feel like they belong there at the same time as well, which is another whole conversation, I think, is belonging. We
yeah,
could talk about that for another half an hour, I think. But
yeah.
yeah.
No, and you're right, Natasha. I think I've definitely had sessions with leaders, and these are board leaders that we're talking about here, where at the end of the conversation, they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, thank you, Aggie." We were just talking about race, by the way, which is not the easiest conversation. Like,
Mm.
"Oh, you're welcome, thank you." And I'm like, "Yes, I thought you were going to come and tell us off and tell us all the things we're doing wrong." So exactly what you've just spoken about, and I get it because some of the way we do have, not we, you and I, clearly, Natasha, because we're not there,
We're on
but
the same page.
yeah, but the way the conversation's had, especially on social media, which is super divisive, etc., you
Mm.
can see why people feel like they're being told off all the time. You can see that. And yes, there are some behaviors that we need to say that's not helpful, that's not inclusive. Sometimes that does happen, but in most cases, none of us who are alive today created racism. None of us did. So that's one truth. Another truth is that the system still lives and breathes, is another truth. And the other truth is that it lives and breathes in our organizations. And it means that some people do have more of the if we're going to call it a cake, if we must, than they should, bigger slices than they potentially should. And some people don't. And some people do enjoy the privileges and some people don't. And it's about how do we equalize that, respecting, understanding the fact that no one in this organization made racism, and there'll be things that have been happening unintentionally as well.
Thank you so much, Aggie. Before you do have to leave us. Um, I would love to hear some parting piece of advice that you can give to those leaders out there that are are leading the charge. So they're working in diversity, equity, inclusion as well as you are, and they're trying to make a change. What advice would you give to them?
Thank you. Because the advice I would give to them is, if they're not doing this already, which I'm sure a lot of us are, is take a very human-centered approach and meet people where they are. Yes, there are some, as we said before, some behaviors that do need to be called out or to be clear that that's not acceptable or that's not helpful or that doesn't lean into the values that we've espoused on our website. So we need to have some of those conversations. And I have, and I sometimes do have some of those conversations as well. But more often than not, it's about people who've got a certain lived experience and they've experienced life in a certain way, which means that they don't understand what it's like to experience racism. They don't see it because they haven't had to experience it necessarily. So maybe having that compassionate challenge approach, which is what I tend to have. And I don't know if you can see, you probably can just about see love above my head. So I think
Yeah.
I'm going to say compassionate challenge in terms of love, but definitely for yourself. I think we are running the race, and we're holding the baton. It's been handed to us from people who fought before and did the work before, and in a much more overt way, I would suggest. We're running our leg of the race and holding the baton. Sometimes it's okay to put it down because this work can be quite taxing emotionally and mentally and everything else. Put the baton down sometimes, rest and recuperate if you need to, and then when you're ready, pick it back up again, and keep going. We need to change some of the experiences that our people are experiencing, and I mean people in this fullest sense. In workplaces, we've got the next generations coming up. Little people being born right now that are coming up as well, and let's keep doing what we can to make their experiences a more positive one when they reach the world of work.
Oh, that's some great advice there, Aggie. Thank you so much. Um, I know Mahogany Partners, you do a lot of work with organizations, but also for individuals as well, in trying to bring out more awareness, trying to get the information out there to them. So, for our listeners, if they want to learn a little bit more, how can they do that?
Thank you for saying that. So absolutely. So Mahogany Inclusion Partners. I think if you Google it, it should come up. But it's mahoganyinclusionpartners.com, and you can find out about all the work we do supporting organizations on their inclusion journeys in the fullest sense, but also and their racial equity journeys as well. And I'm also a coach as well. So I do coach a lot of underrepresented groups, but also leaders on their journeys, whether it's their journeys from a diversity and inclusion point of view, whether it's just general sort of life and leadership coaching. So if you want to connect with me, then it's Aggie and then Yemurai, which is my middle name. So Yemurai Mutuma on LinkedIn. So find me there.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I will be linking down below the episode links to your LinkedIn profile, as you said, and also to your website. So all of those resources will be accessible to everyone that is listening, so they can go and access that. Please don't come for me, Aggie, if you get your inbox flooded with people. um,
I'll
but
come and thank you.
yeah, yeah. But no, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. I appreciate you taking the time out. Appreciate all the work that you're doing in the space. It is important. It is impactful, and just keep going.
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. I love what you're doing as well. So same to you too. Keep going.